So let me talk about that initial investigation. Let me be clear up front. The determination that I just mentioned about his not being reinstated command and the action, the holding the strike group commander's promotion in abeyance, that's not about the email that he sent, and it's certainly not about the fact that it leaked. The initial investigation took a narrow look at why he sent that email. And we took the facts, and I followed the facts from that narrowly scoped investigation. And I was tasked to take a look at those facts against then Acting Secretary Moodley's justification for relieving him. And I did not feel that the facts supported the justification. Justification included assertions that Captain Crozier went outside the chain of command in the email. He said that he went to the media in the email. At one point, he said that the media was included in the chain of command. He opined that the email was handled recklessly, and that's why it leaked. Captain Crozier hit send once in that email. Captain Crozier did not leak that email or intend for it to be leaked. So, at that time, I felt that the facts did not justify relief based on the narrow scope. Again, had I known then what I know today, I would have relieved him back then. That time, the Acting Secretary of the Navy, McPherson, felt that the investigation should be broader, increased in scope, go all the way back to the decision to pull a ship into Vietnam, the time in Port Vietnam, the transit back to Guam, and the time in Port Guam. And so that gave us a much clearer view of Captain Crozier's performance in command. And as I mentioned earlier, I mentioned three kind of primary lenses through which I viewed the investigation. And the last one, and really the most critical right now with respect to this broader investigation, was standards of performance and command and decision-making in crisis.
Jennifer, I'll come to you.
So, are we to understand that basically that COVID would not have spread on board the TR as quickly as it did if Captain Crozier had taken certain measures? Are you blaming him for the spread of COVID because he was slow to react? And do you believe that this letter was some sort of covering himself from those actions?
So let me take the second question first. So in terms of the email and the letter that he sent, when he hit send on that email, 6 hours before, the governor of Guam had already agreed to allow us to use hotel rooms. The only requirement that she had at that point, and this issue had been worked, this was on a Monday. So on the preceding Sunday and Saturday, there were conversations between the regional commander and the governor. And then on Sunday, the Hotel Association was brought into the discussion. By Monday, she agreed to open up the hotels. The Hotel Association was supportive. The only thing that she required was a call from a four-star. So within that day, there was a call from Admiral Aquilino that then opened up the hotels the following day. So my point's about checking the facts before you fire a flare up the chain of command. Captain Crozier was aware that those negotiations were ongoing. It was only the day before, on Sunday, that he levied the requirement for not just 4,000 beds, but for 4,000 hotel rooms. And so when the commander of U.S. Pacific Fleet received that email, he reached out and immediately talked to Admiral Baker and Captain Crozier. And his question was, what else do you need me to do that we're not doing now? And the response was to move faster on the hotels. Aquilino said, look, we are making up to 2,000 beds available off the ship so that you can release people off the ship, get them in a safer place. We can begin to get them healthy. We can begin to clean the ship more thoroughly, and then we can restore to normal operations as quickly as possible. And so the reason why Crozier sent the email was because he felt when he sent it that we weren't moving fast enough on the hotels. But based on what I just said, those wheels were well in motion. The outside support from other echelons of the chain of command, besides working the hotel issue, included commanders reaching out to the Republic of Korea so that we could then process testing samples at scale, up to 1,000 a day. military airlift being stationed in Guam with the sole purpose of that aircraft and the aircrew to run those samples back and forth to the peninsula of Korea so that we could turn 300 to 500 samples a day. Bringing a medical team of 50-plus people from Okinawa to support, to augment the small medical team on TR, examples of other activity that were going on. I really felt that there were a few key issues here with respect to what I believe to be an almost paralysis of that command team from the time they pulled in port until the time that we were able to get the hotels. During the transit itself, I didn't feel like they followed all the guidelines as thoroughly as they should. There were some things that they absolutely did right. We found that our determination is that the cod flakes, for example, that came out of the Philippines, the 5 flights, that they weren't the vector of infection on the ship. We ruled that out based on testing that we did and symptoms tracing that we were doing on those air crews after they arrived on TR. I thought that they could have done a much better job of physical distancing. I think you saw indications of that when Crozier left the ship and the crew packed together. That was not a primary measure that we viewed as critically important. And again, he did a bunch of things right. I think he could have did better then. I'm not grounding the relief based on the fact that I think social distancing could have been better. I do think that Naval Base Guam moved mountains to make beds available. And so those beds, in terms of the specifications, they were placed 6 feet apart, 72 square feet were allotted for each sailor. And so although it wasn't individual rooms, it was the best that we had. Now, there were also hotel rooms on the base that were made available. There was vacant housing that was made available. There were barracks that were made available. There were ships that had excess berthing that we were going to make available as well. And so the naval base was working at speed to make beds available every day. On the day that Crozier had sent in the email, that 24 hours in that period, there were 700 beds unfilled. There were 500 the day before. There were 300 the day before that. So if I go back to the primary responsibility of the CO was the safety and well-being of the crew so that we could move them to a better place and get the ship back to its full operational capability as soon as possible. I was not impressed by the slow egress off the ship, the lack of a plan to do so, the 7th Fleet Commander's demand for a plan that he didn't receive until the day Crozier got relieved. That was 6-7 days into the port visit. So I found both from a standpoint of planning and execution that they fell well short. They also made the decision on Sunday to lift quarantine in the aft portion of the ship. So there are 1,000 people in the aft portion of the ship. They lifted quarantine, and so they commingle those members in the ship. Again, it would have made sense to me that if you're going to do that, if you need to relieve some of that pressure, that they would have filled some of those 700 beds ashore. That decision, in my view, was one of comfort over safety. And again, safety was thing one. And I think there were other decisions that were made, some of them self-limiting in terms of getting people ashore, that had everything to do with comfort over safety.
Barbara will come to you next.
Admiral Gilday, you're laying out a number of things that you saw at the time that concerned you. Paralysis of command, just things lining up one after another that you observed as this process is going on. So what I don't understand is, why did the Navy then simply inquire into the email? Why did, if you knew it, Admiral Burke knew it. So my question is, how is it not a conclusion that the Navy was basically investigating the wrong, not the full problem? And Mr. Secretary, after Admiral Gilday, if I could just ask you as well, and I realize you came after this, sir, but it seems the Navy knew all along that there were a series of problems. Did nobody tell you? But you seem to have some awareness of it. And what did the Navy hear from Captain Crozier? Did they interview him? What explanation did he have?
So my awareness, Admiral Burke's awareness, Admiral Aquilino's awareness of those problems with decision-making and rapid egress Those were never visible to us until we did the deeper investigation.
Is
So,
that not a problem? Seriously.
So if I go back to at Echelon 1 in the Navy, my questions are to the Pacific Fleet Commander, what do you need? As an example, he needs authority to be able to use Mil-Air to take those samples to Korea. We took care of that. We needed to order people from Okinawa to Guam. We took care of that. Things that Admiral Aquilino was doing at his level and the 7th Fleet Commander was doing at his level were all in support of Crozier. I go back to Crozier's email where he says, command is absolute. It's my ship and it's my crew. And I believe it should have also been his plan and his plan to execute, and all other echelons are in support of that command. Based on all the examples I gave you, the testing in Korea, the spaces that were becoming available on Naval Base Guam, the negotiations on the hotel, the medical teams from Okinawa. So,
should Admiral Aquilino have known more than he did? I guess I don't understand. How is it up and down, nobody knew? And what did Captain Crozier tell? Was he interviewed? What did he have to say? But how does nobody know?
Captain Crozier has never said in his email, you never saw the line, he certainly said, I need these things. What he never said was, I am doing these things. This was all about what Crozier failed to do within his span of control. I looked at the span of control of the Commander of Pacific Fleet. I looked at the span of control of the Commander of 7th Fleet. I did not see those problems. We wouldn't necessarily see those issues bubble up unless Crozier raised them. If he had a problem, let's say he thought that the accommodations in the gym with the bed 6 feet apart, he didn't like that. That's one of the reasons he didn't send people ashore at speed, because he wanted the hotel rooms. We didn't have the hotel rooms. The best we had were the facilities that I mentioned a few minutes ago. Use them as best you can. Back to thing one, safety of the crew. Baker and Crozier were talking to the 7th Fleet Commander every day. If they had issues, they should have raised them. If he fearlessly communicated with that email that he sent, that I've never disagreed with his fearlessly sending the email, then he certainly should have just the same fearlessly communicated issues every day during those video teleconferences.
All right, we'll take a few questions from the phone. We'll go to Missy Ryan from the Post.
Hey, sorry, it's Paul Tony from the Post. I'm stepping in for Missy. Can you hear me? Hello? Admiral, I just wanted to ask whether, I think the impression will probably be from a lot of people on the TR that essentially this is blaming the captain and the admiral for the failings of wider Navy leadership that should have been more attuned and prepared for what was going on. And I was wondering if you could speak to that.
Sure will. So when the 7th Fleet, after Captain Crozier's relief, the 7th Fleet Commander flew from his command ship, the Blue Ridge, onto Guam, and he spent an hour and a half answering questions for the crew until they ran out of questions to ask. He was clear to them that the reason that he was putting pressure on Crozier to put people in those gyms and in those rooms ashore was because he was putting safety over comfort. That's the first time anybody had explained that to that crew. And he told me when I spoke to the 7th Fleet Commander that that was an eye-opener for him, and it was an eye-opener for the crew. One of the last calls I made this afternoon was to the current Strike Group Commander and the current CO of the Theodore Roosevelt to prepare them for when they wake up tomorrow morning and this news hits the streets, or they first learn about it. They both feel that the crew is going to accept the rationale that we lay out, that they have a better understanding now than they did back then of why things happen the way they happen.
All right, Nancy Youssef from the Journal.
Thank you. Admiral, do you know now who patient zero was on the Theodore Roosevelt? Is there any indication that it came onto the ship more than one way? And who did you communicate with outside of the military? That is, were any of these decisions or recommendations communicated with the White House beforehand? Thank you.
Yeah, so let me take your first question, and if it's okay, sir, I'll turn the second question over to you. So your first question again, I'm sorry, Ms. Youssef, was it was about the vector for infection on the ship, and so no, we've not been able to specifically understand who patient 0 was on TR, and I think part of that is because of the asymptomatic nature of COVID. And so it incubates at different paces for different people. And so we don't have a good enough understanding. Based on the investigation, we think that likely it happened during the port visit to Vietnam. And when you read the report, we took an extensive look at the decision making before the ship pulled into Vietnam, the actions that the ship took in terms of precautions as they were in Vietnam, and then what they did transiting out of Vietnam. And I'm certainly happy to cover some of that for you. But ma'am, we don't have a clear understanding of patient 0.
So the second part of the question, I'd first like to go back to what Barbara had stated. I think that this is truly illustrates the importance of a thorough investigation. I think, as Admiral Gilday has indicated, if we had done the due diligence from the beginning, we would have come up with the total facts that would have led us to make the right conclusion much earlier than today. Unfortunately, emotion got in the way, and a rush to judgment perhaps became part of the equation. I think the entire country has learned a lot through this COVID experience, and it's always easy to play Monday morning quarterback and go back and guess the actions of those who acted the way they did. I am very proud of the way that the United States Navy has reacted to this. When you think about the totality of this virus and how it's affected America, you will see that we really only had 2 ships that were significantly affected. And out of that, both those ships are back underway and fully mission capable. As far as my responsibility, again, I am a former military officer who believes in the chain of command. I have discussed the findings of this report with my boss, the Secretary of Defense, Dr. Mark Esper, who also upholds our conclusions. Farther than that, that is up to Dr. Esper to determine, and I would refer any follow-on questions you would have to him.
All right, we'll come back to him here. David?
Would this deeper investigation ever have been conducted had Dr. Crozier written that letter?
I can't say that definitively, but certainly the email and the leak was the genesis of all this.
So he's not being relieved for the letter, but it's because of the letter that you had the investigation.
Correct.
That led to his.
So as I said earlier, this isn't about the email and it's not about the leak. And I go back to my comments about fearless communications up the chain of command. We need commanders to communicate up the chain of command. But yes, that's what led to Crozier's firing. And if you remember, back at that time, I had recommended an investigation before we made a determination on whether to fire. And so the investigation happened after his relief.
So does it bother you that if he hadn't written that letter and you had just gone through the normal course of business, you never would have surfaced these problems?
It's good to get after these issues. We learned a lot from TR. The issue here really, David, is about standards of performance, and particularly in crisis. And so when you read the report, I think you'll probably come to the same conclusion that I did. As bad as I feel for Captain Crozier and Admiral Baker and their families, I've got a responsibility to put the best people possible on a ship that is now operating in the Philippine Sea with 2 other strike groups. You've seen the Chinese reactions to our ships out there. I can't have anybody, I need people gripping problems. I need them driving solutions. I need them communicating fearlessly. This put enough doubt in my mind, as I said before, had I known then what I know now, I would have relieved them.
All right, Courtney.
A couple of things. Admiral Gilday, I'm still having a hard time understanding how your assessment of the paralysis of the command team and then the urgency of the email that he sent. How do you square those? And then can you also just explain a little bit more about Rear Admiral Baker? You said that it would be his promotion to two-star would be delayed pending further review. Is that a grade determination board, or who does that review?
Yeah. Could I take that one? I'll take that one first, if you would. And so I made the decision through a normal course of events to have a normal turnover of the strike group commander before they get underway. The reason I did that is because I knew that pending the results of the investigation, I could still hold Baker accountable. I didn't want to do a turnover in the South China Sea when they were operating with two other strike groups. I wanted that operational continuity. So I discussed it with operational commanders, and that's the decision that we made. And so with respect to his promotion being held in advance, so as part of the recommendations and report, there are administrative actions that'll be taken against Admiral Baker. So that would be in the form of a letter, and that determination will be made by Admiral Aquilino, the Pacific Fleet Commander. That'll then lead through an administrative process that will finally come to the Secretary of the Navy to make a decision on whether or not he should be promoted. He's already Senate confirmed. And I'm sorry, your preceding questions?
If you can explain the difference between the analysis that there was this paralysis of the command and then this urgency in the email that Captain Crozier sent. I just don't understand. I think that was the thing that got so much attention about it, is it seemed like such this desperate plea for help.
Correct.
So how do you explain it seems as if you're saying that he wasn't actually helping his sailors? So my point is that I feel he was placing them at greater risk. Again, I go back to comfort in front of safety. As I look at the facts, that's what stood out to me. And again, I talked about his primary responsibility was safety and well-being of the crew so that we could get back to maximum operational readiness. We knew that we could always get that ship underway with 6 sailors if we had to, if the operational environment and crisis drove us to that. But what we wanted to do was move people aboard off the ship as quickly as we could. That's why we had people at the Naval Station working 24/7 to open up. The initial requirement was 1,000 beds, and so they exceeded expectations with more than 2,400 beds within a week. I haven't been able to come to a great understanding of why the email either. And so there were really 3 courses of action that were either in planning or in execution. So the course of action that was in execution, again, safety being the primary issue here, was to get people off the ship to Naval Base Guam into available accommodations, right? The second COA, which was more constrained, was to augment the first COA with hotel rooms from Guam. And again, ship pulls on Friday, negotiations Saturday, Sunday, agreement on Monday. The third COA, which was contingency planning, was to look at space available in Okinawa. That was a bigger lift. So if we needed 4,000 beds at Naval Base Guam, and it became physically impossible to do that, could we take a small segment of the crew and move them to Okinawa into 3 MEFS accommodations, right? That's an 8-hour flight. Operationally, it's not what we wanted, but again, if safety's thing 1, that's what we would have looked at. So that was a third COA. And to be quite honest with you, Captain Crozier was very frustrated that the ship was spending time working that contingency COA. And so my response to that is that if you're planning for the Okinawa COA, the airlift COA, if that was taken away from the resources and focus you had to place on the COA that was in execution, and you're talking to the 7th Fleet Commander every day, there's your opportunity for fearless communication to say, look, I need to reorder priorities. Or if there was confusion, as you'll see in the report, about whether people should be tested before they move to accommodations, the 7th Fleet Commander cleared that up within hours because that's conflicting guidance. Get them off quickly was the primary thing. Test before getting off was, with limited testing capability at the time, would have conflicted with that. So this is all about, if you have constraints or barriers and you can't break them at your level, yeah, you got to shoot a flare because I can't do what you told me to do. That wasn't happening. That's the part of the piece that I spoke to Ms. Starr about, that I did not see that grip in the problem, that drive in solutions, getting after it. And it was, quite frankly, it was disappointing.
All right, we'll go back to the phones. Idris from Reuters.
Thanks. So just a quick question. Other than Captain Crozier and the strike group commander, are there going to be any other punishments up and down the chain or on the ship? And secondly, at any point, just going back to Nancy's question, at any point did you hear from the White House during the investigation about what their preferences were, or any sort of communication from the White House about the investigation?
The answer to the first question, no. Admiral?
So this is with respect to the White House.
I answered the question from the White House. I received no communication whatsoever with anybody at the White House. I've only communicated up the chain of command to the Secretary of Defense. The second question had to do with additional personnel on the ship for potential administrative or punitive action.
So the recommendation made in the report that I endorse is for administrative action to be taken against the CO of Theodore Roosevelt, the carrier air wing commander embarked aboard, the ship's medical officer who's part of the cruise company. And so I will be giving direction to the commander of Pacific Fleet that he will take care of that administrative action. The reason I'm not doing that from the Pentagon is because those types of letters, as an example, whether they're punitive or non-punitive letters of reprimand, that's correspondence directly between a senior and a subordinate, not the CNO. And so I'm putting this back in the chain of command when it belongs, and there's no hesitation by Admiral Aquilino to do that. So he will take a look at the report, and then he will determine the tone, the substance, the level of administrative action that needs to be taken.
All right, we'll come back to the room here. Tara.
Thank you. So in your investigation, you determined that the cod flights were not a likely factor, and it would most likely would have been the port visit in Vietnam. Who authorized the port visit, and is that person being held accountable? And then thinking back to that port visit, at the time when we were asking questions about it, the answers were of the tenor of, well, we didn't know that Vietnam, there's only a few cases, didn't really know the extent of this, and at the same time getting briefings of all the plans were in development of how to handle COVID. Even this own building was still dealing with how to socially distance at the time. So how do you hold Captain Crozier to a standard that people were still kind of figuring out as this was unfolding on his ship?
So that'll be part of the investigation that you can read. But part of that, so let me speak to that for just a moment. So determinations were made during the planning phases for weeks and then the days leading up to that port visit, where there were communications with the CDC director in Vietnam, the WHO. At that time, and still I think to this day, Vietnam has received among the highest grades of any country in the world consistently with respect to preventative actions and containment actions that they've taken. At the time, the questions that we had were whether or not the 16 known cases in the vicinity of Hanoi, which was 450 miles from the port Da Nang, whether or not those were considered to be accurate. And the CDC director, through the CDC in Washington, told us that there was a high degree of confidence that that reporting was accurate and that the Vietnamese were being transparent. So, based on indications like that, as well as precautions that we put in place, as an example, the Theodore Roosevelt was among our first ships, and I would say among the first military units to have a testing capability for COVID. We had a testing capability for influenza-like illnesses, and that same equipment could test for COVID. So we had COVID testing. We brought on a preventative medical team that has an understanding of viruses like COVID. We brought them onto TR. Everybody in the crew was briefed. Their symptoms were checked before they left the ship. When they came back to the ship, any location that they went to had to be approved by the Department of State. Hotels, clubs. The crews of both the Bunker Hill that was pierside and Roosevelt that was anchored were not allowed to buy food in port. There were 39 members of the crew that we discovered had been in a hotel where there were two possible COVID cases. When we learned of that, we brought everybody ashore from Liberty. The ship got underway the next day. Those 39 people were tested and quarantined. none of the initial positives were among those 39. So based on both planning and the precautions that went into that, we think that at the time that those judgments were sound. And so that determination was made by the Pac Fleet commander, who briefed up and received concurrence from the Indo-Pacific Command commander.
So just to follow up, the Pac Fleet commander authorized the port visit?
Ultimately, the Indo-PACOM commander authorized the port visit.
But just also following on that, decisions sound at the time. Did you end up interviewing Captain Crozier? Did he ever explain that he was using his own best sound decisions at the time to do X, Y, Z?
That's a good question. So I think, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I think what you're really getting at is looking at the facts through the context of what was going on at the time. Are we holding two commanders to different standards? So it's a good question. I don't think so. So if I take a look at what Crozier was dealing with, and yeah, we had a lot of questions at that time about the transmission of asymptomatic cases would be a good example and how the virus behaved. But what we surely knew that anybody that tested positive had to be isolated, and we were doing that. And we surely knew that anybody that came in contact with anybody who had positive had to be quarantined. And that we surely knew that we were in a better place getting those people off the ship. So even given what we didn't understand about COVID, we understood that. And so, commanders, had it been another commander, whether it was a strike commander or a ship's commander, I think we wouldn't be in this position right now.
All right, Megan, we'll come to you next.
This question is for the Secretary. So one of the biggest pieces of fallout from all of this was, of course, former Acting Secretary Modly's behavior and sort of the tension that created with sailors throughout the Navy, but particularly on the TR. So now that you're in this position and it's time to smooth that over, what kind of plan do you have to get out to the fleet and kind of heal that relationship between sailors and their civilian secretary?
Thank you for that question. I've been in the job now. This is the conclusion of my third week. I've already had the opportunity to visit with our sailors and Marines twice. This week I didn't get out because we're in the midst of some deep budget discussions, but I don't think there is any more important role as a secretary than assuring the men and women of the Navy that there is a steady and firm leadership of their department. I've really enjoyed these visits. I flew aboard the Harry S. Truman on my fourth day in the job, and last week I went down aboard the Ford as well as over to NAS Oceana to visit our sailors. And I can tell you that the morale of the men and women is very good. And I think we can put some of these incidents behind us, especially now that we've concluded this. We can move on and focus on what we need to focus on, and that's readiness and being able to appropriately defend the United States.
Do you have any priorities that you've been sharing with them?
Yep, so I talked a lot about culture. I've talked a lot about our duty to those that we serve with, left and right. As well as those who have gone before us, as well as that being reflective on who we are to attract the sailors and Marines of the future. I've also reassured them of my intent to look out for their best interests, whether that's to ensure they get the right resources to do their jobs appropriately, as well as to support them with the right type of benefits and other things that we provide them. And then finally, again, just reassuring them that we understand how demanding and challenging a role that they have, whether they're at sea or ashore. It can be a very demanding thing to serve in the uniform of our nation.
All right, Sam Legon will come to you next.
Yeah, hi. Just to follow up on the idea of scope of command. So you talked about Captain Crozier's scope of command. Can you talk a little bit more about what the scope of command and the responsibilities were for Admiral Baker? And then beyond that, it seems like you're drawing a pretty thick line around the strike group in and of itself. What about the CTF-70 commander? What findings did you have that the 7th Fleet commander may have had a responsibility or things that they could have done differently? Or did that stop inside the strike group? Thank you.
So I go back to, Sam, thanks for the question. I go back to his ship, his crew, his plan to drive and execute. All the other echelons, their job to support. And I gave examples of the things that were going on across the theater to support TR. And so within the span of control of those other commanders, I saw positive action. I saw great initiative. I saw great follow-up. We didn't necessarily, when for example, Captain Crozier sent that email to Aquilino, he called him because he said, I don't understand what else you need that we're not providing at 1 or 2 echelons or 3 echelons up from you. And the response was to go faster with the hotels. Again, I go back to never check the facts. The hotel deal was done 6 hours prior. It was, I don't have a good answer for the exact why he sent that email. We've never received a good answer with respect to that. But I do think that I have enough evidence within Crozier and Baker's span of control to question their decision making.
Jeff Struggle.
Thank you. Question for Admiral Gilday. If Admiral Davidson ultimately made the decision to allow, or better yet, to tell the Theodore Roosevelt to have the port call in Vietnam, why is he not being disciplined?
Because we found no fault with the rationale to make the decision to go in a port.
I thought earlier you had mentioned something about going to Vietnam during this COVID pandemic, so I'm a little unclear on that, but at the same time, you're holding the captain to a higher standard than the person who sent his ship into Vietnam. Why?
I disagree. So the decision on the port visit was made a week before the WHO declared COVID a pandemic. At the time they made the port visit, the Department of State travel advisory level was level 1. No additional precautions required. We took a look at several. We did not make a decision to make that port visit until the day before. We exhausted several means and sources of information before we made a determination to put that ship in a port. We had no positive cases in Da Nang. As a good example, the Bunker Hill was pierside. We've had 0 positive cases on that cruiser.
Well, one last one, and I appreciate you bearing with me. Admiral Davidson made the decision to send the Theodore Roosevelt to Vietnam, and a sailor died. How is this not a case of different spanks for different ranks?
So we took a look at that decision to go into port. We found that decision is sound. We lay all this out, all the evidence that I've just provided off the top of my head. There's additional information that led us to conclude that was a sound decision, that risk was adequately considered and mitigated by a lot of the precautions that we put in place: testing equipment, medical experts, testing symptoms of the crew on and off the ship, immediately securing liberty when we did find out that they could have been in contact with somebody in a hotel, getting underway within 24 hours. So there's a number of things that Admiral Davidson was witting of that were justified. I think that will bear the test of scrutiny.
All right, we'll take 2 final questions from the phones. Tony Capaccio, you're first.
Hi, Admiral. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Hey, Admiral, I wanted to check one thing. Is it fair to say that had not Secretary Esper pushed back on your original investigation, you would not have done the deeper dive?
I can't say that. And so my discussions after I made my recommendation to Acting Secretary McPherson, and the only communications I had after making my recommendation, I did present my findings to Secretary Esper at the time. He did not agree or disagree with my presentation. It was the following week when I met with Acting Secretary McPherson, when he directed me to conduct a deeper investigation because he thought that there might be more to the story than the narrowly focused investigation that we were originally directed to do. At the time, Secretary McPherson thought that my recommendations were sound based on the facts and the case that I presented, the determination that I made off the facts that I reviewed. In both of these investigations, I've come to my conclusions based on the facts.
Was the original investigation rushed, though? In retrospect, should you just have waited?
Of course, given Secretary Braithwaite captured it very well. Given a choice, yes, we should have done a broader investigation. At the time, we were looking at a very narrowly focused investigation. The Navy was served better by a broader investigation. I did not, and nobody in the Navy pushed back in that direction to look more deeply at this issue.
All right, last question. We'll go to Paul McCleary from Breaking Fence. All right, Mike Glenn, we'll come to you then here in the room. Good. All right, thank you all very much for your time today.
Thank you.
Have a good day.